Welcome to OpenEdge Database Monitoring Baseline Configuration. In this session, we're going to talk about how to gather basic information that you should have about your environment so that when you are inevitably asked what changed, you won't be the person who says, nothing at all.
I'm Tom Bascom. I've been a Progress user, coder, and roaming DBA since 1987. Here at White Star Software, we specialize in simplifying the job of managing and monitoring the world's best business applications. We're also the authors of ProTop, the best OpenEdge monitoring tool in the galaxy. We offer remote database management services for OpenEdge databases and expert consulting services related to all aspects of Progress in OpenEdge. If you need to reach me for any reason, send me an email, tom@wss.com. Thank you, and let's get started with today's session.
So let's start with why is configuration data important? What do you need to know this data for? What do you do with it? What use is it to you to have this data? Well, one of the things that you can use it for is to verify that you're following best practices. It also comes in very handy for audits and security questions when those come around from corporate or from external vendors. And you have to answer a lot of questions about that. Anytime you're going to do a migration or where you need to restore a database or maybe go through a disaster recovery exercise, you're going to need configuration data. And of course, the ever-present what changed question. Whenever there's a performance issue or a reliability issue, people are going to want to know what has changed in the environment in order to be able to narrow down the root cause. You may say to yourself, well, I would know if any of that configuration data changed. But would you really? Do you do everything? Are you both the database administrator, the system administrator, the application administrator, the business administrator? Who covers when you're on vacation? Are they going to need to know some of this information? Is it going to be useful or helpful to them? And it's also important to realize that the default values sometimes change quietly with new releases, not just OpenEdge default values, but also your operating system and your operating environment may have changes that you're not prepared for. And how is any of this helpful with monitoring? Well, having a good handle on the configuration data can help you to identify the root cause of unexpected performance changes, particularly after there's been some business growth or the users have changed the way that they use the application. So they've changed a business process, or maybe they've changed the way they go about doing things. You may have shared resource contention if you're on any kind of a shared environment with virtualized machines or SANs or any of that kind of stuff. There can be changes when new applications are introduced or when older applications start being used in different ways. There may be a harmless change to the virtualization or to an OS patch. Something like that could happen, which could throw you for a loop. A software release. So your operating system upgrades, it's Tuesday night patch night and something gets released from Microsoft and bang, all of a sudden your performance goes in the tube. So it's also helpful to be able to document that a change that you made didn't have any impact. So if you know that you made a change to the code on Wednesday and that it ran without any issues until the following Tuesday, well, it probably wasn't the code change that was at fault. So what else should you know about other than the OpenEdge environment? Well, you should know about the business environment. You should know what sort of business you're in, what the ups and downs of that business are, what the drivers of volume are, what makes the business go well, what makes the business go badly, so that if there's a sudden expansion in the business, you're not caught by surprise. Likewise, if there's a contraction, you're ready for that as well. You should know about your infrastructure. Don't just focus on the database. You need to know about the hardware and the network and the systems that the database is running on. You need to talk to your peers in the storage group, your peers in the networking group. You need to understand the sysadmin's approach to things because that all has an impact on how your database runs. the operating system, its configuration, that's really important, and the application software. Progress applications aren't just a database. There's a database plus code, and there are an awful lot of options that cross over between them, and the typical OpenEdge DBA needs to be pretty comfortable with both. And of course, the OpenEdge configuration. Now, we're going to mostly talk about the OpenEdge configuration. We don't really have a lot of time to talk about the business environment or the infrastructure or any of those kinds of things. But you should take some time to go and talk to your business partners, understand what their key performance indicators are, understand how external circumstances fuel or constrain growth, and be tuned in to changes that are coming down the pike. If there's a big acquisition coming or you're about to be purchased by somebody, you don't want to be caught by surprise. Likewise, if you're running in a virtualized environment, you should have access to, or at least know somebody who has access to, the consoles for that software, so that you're able to capture some of that configuration information to know how it is currently configured, so that if a surprise change happens, you can go back and say, well, you used to have it configured like this, now it's configured like that, and there's a problem. Likewise for the SAN and for the network. They all have software for managing them. They all have built-in tools, and you should be able to get access to that. So let's talk about getting the facts about your OpenEdge database configuration. One of the most important things that you need to know about your OpenEdge configuration is what are the installed licenses. There's a utility called showConfig, showCFG, which helps you to verify that you have the components that you need and the right port in terms of the operating system and the number of bits, whether it's a 32-bit port or a 64-bit port, and the user counts that you expect to have. Now, if you're in a Windows environment, then you might run the GUI version of showConfig off of the program group menu, and that's shown in the lower left here. Or if you're on a command line version of things, or even on Windows, if you're in the ProEnv window, then you can just type showCFG, or on Windows, showCFGD, which gives you the text version of things, which is quite a bit easier to read, actually. You don't have to scroll down it if you do it that way. And that will tell you what you have installed in terms of what kinds of licenses, when they were installed, what the user count associated with them is, and all that kind of stuff, which can be very handy information to have. Another great utility is called the ProUtil Describe, and this describes the persistent and physical configuration options of the database. Things like the block size and the cluster size that you have set up for the database. Tells you when the database was created, tells you about the before image block size, cluster size, the after imaging information, as well as things like whether or not you have replication enabled, whether you've enabled large files, database auditing, and other optional features of the Progress database, which are stored in the database physically rather than as startup parameters. The structure file tells you where the individual extents or files that make up the database are stored. They may not all be in one folder or one directory. They may be in several places. And the structure file helps you to find them as well as define what their sizes are going to be. You can get the structure file, the current structure file, with a prostruct list. So the command is prostruct list, then the database name. That will output directly to the screen, as well as create a new file called dbname.st, which has the record of how your structure is laid out in it. This is very important, particularly if you're doing certain operations like a restore, or maybe you're changing the location of some of the extents, so you might want to do a prostruct repair to have that structure available. And then there are various properties files, PF files, and scripts scattered around the system. They may be in different locations. And it's really good to document where these things are, because which ones are actually being used in your environment can vary over time. Now, if you're doing a managed database using OpenEdge Explorer or the dbman command, then your setup is in $DLC properties conmanager.properties. But if you're doing a scripted approach, then you may have shell scripts that may be in a lot of different places. They may not be where you expect them to be. You really need to record where those are. In the case of a blended environment, you may have PF files that are specified in conmanager.properties, and so you need to know where those are, and you need to be able to find them fairly easily. When people are trying to help you out, they're going to need to know these things. If you have replication enabled, then the database name .repl.properties is stored in the database root directory, and you should probably have a record of what the value of that is. And all this stuff probably also ought to be under source code control, so that if unexpected changes are made, you know who made them, when they made them, and why. Now, the database log file itself has a record of what the startup options were that were used to start the database the last time it was started up. Basically, just open the log file with any text editor, search for message 333, and then the next, well, it depends a little bit on what version of Progress it is, because there's more and more parameters with every version. But the next 100 to 200 lines of text will be the startup parameters that were actually used to start up the database. And this can be really, really helpful when you think that maybe something has been changed that you didn't expect to be changed. Lastly, there are some miscellaneous things, security certificates, encryption keys. Don't forget that any application probably has some scheduled tasks or cron jobs running. And of course, you probably have documentation that needs to be updated from time to time, or that people need to be able to find. And that's all good stuff to have written down and available, and to keep track of, and make sure that your colleagues and anybody who's going to help you out can find all this stuff. So let's talk about getting the facts about your OpenEdge database configuration with ProTop. If you don't have ProTop, go to wss.com/download and get a copy for your system. You can get either Windows or Unix and Linux installs, either R code or source code or Xcoded for most versions of Progress that are out there today. The features that we're going to talk about today are the configuration viewer, the OS info, client server parameters, showing the table and index ranges, the view reports option with the database analysis review and reports, as well as the database parameters report. We're not going to cover the show config info because that would have to show real licenses, and for some reason that just doesn't seem like a good idea. And generating database analysis output is something that takes a little bit of time, so we're going to skip over that. We're going to assume that's already been done. The configuration panel is where most of the information about startup parameters and persistent configuration options can be found. It also has a lot of other interesting information. Now, all of these ProTop screens use color highlighting to try and show you or draw your attention to areas where you should be paying attention to things. For instance, we see right away here that the Progress install 11.7.3 is almost 3 years old at this point in time. That's fairly old. It might be time to be thinking about an upgrade. We can see that the reliability features like crash protection and reliable I/O have been enabled. We have after imaging enabled. We have large files turned on. These are all good things. We do see that the BI size seems quite large. It's about 30 gigs. So this database has allowed its BI file to become quite large. The spin option is colored orange because it's set to 50,000. That's a somewhat questionable value. The lock table is over 1 million, which is a very large value. You really have to kind of question why you need to have 1 million locks. BIT hold, stall, AI stall, those are orange because that's something that you should think about. You should either have BIT hold set and the stall parameters the same or not set, depending on your preferences. We can see that there's a fairly large number of connections per server configured, but we're happy to see that the max message size has been set to a non-default value, that the new PF delay and PF factor and PF number of recs parameters have been set. PF priority has not been set, however, so that should probably be addressed. Then we look and we see that we are using extended type 2 storage areas. That's good. But unfortunately, somebody has allowed a couple of indexes to sneak into the schema area. That's not a good thing. We should fix that. We do have after imaging enabled, and there are 12 after image areas. We're using variable after image extents. That's a good thing. And the AI archiver is enabled. So those are both very good things. The log file is only 6 days old, so we're not allowing the log file to grow to ridiculous sizes. Unfortunately, it's not all that uncommon to see a multi-gigabyte log file, which is really hard to work with. We do see the database analysis is only 2 days old, so that's good. It's nice and fresh. But the SQL stats have not been refreshed for more than a year. So it's been quite some time since anybody's done an update statistics on this database. The table and index range sizes are really important parameters. These help you to be able to monitor activity on the individual tables and indexes within your database. That's really helpful when you're trying to figure out application problems, where there are hotspots, where you might have areas where you could focus a little bit of continuous improvement effort. And this command, the command is capital T, helps you to see whether or not you have them set adequately in the first place, and offers some suggestions. There are basically two approaches you could take. You could set things up so that application tables and indexes are covered, which is the minimal approach here. Or you could go for the complete approach, which includes the system tables and indexes. So you'll be able to see what's happening with the schema information. Now, a lot of times people don't pay attention to schema information, but if your application does compile on the fly, or if you use a lot of dynamic queries and things like that, you may find that there's a surprising amount of activity going on in those system tables. So it can be very helpful to enable the complete table and index range sizes. When this command is run, it also creates a temporary PF file that you can use as a template to add to your startup parameters if you're wanting to do that. OS info gives you information about the operating system. Now, this varies a little bit from operating system to operating system. We can't get all the same information for Windows that we can get for Linux. We can't get all the same information for HP or Solaris or AIX that we can for the others. But to the best of its ability, it tries to go out there and find out some interesting things about the configuration of your operating system. In particular, the amount of memory that you have, whether or not you have NUMA configuration, how many cores are allocated to your server, and whether or not they're in a hypervisor. So in this particular case, the hypervisor is blank, so this is not a virtual machine. This is actual physical hardware. We can see that we're running a Xeon E7, that it's running at 3.4 gigahertz, which is reasonable. It was fast a few years ago, but these days it's not quite the top of the line. And that there are 24 real cores and 48 logical CPUs. In other words, hyperthreading has been enabled. There are 4 sockets and 4 NUMA nodes, which means that potentially we have some NUMA performance problems that might come into play here. Another great ProTop report is the capital R command, which basically gives you a viewer of all the database parameters. Now, this is the same as what you get from looking in the database log file and looking for message 333. But this is in a report format, and it's what is current. So as of the last time the database started, and it also includes anything that's been changed online. So if there have been any online parameter changes, those also show up in here. This is a scrollable screen. I've just shown the first 20 some odd lines here, but you can go through this and see what all of the current database startup parameters are. Very handy. You can make a copy of this if you want to keep records of it and tuck that away somewhere. Another report which is very helpful is the remote servers report. And this pulls together all the information about configuration of servers, client-server servers. So you have a number of common parameters like -n, which is the total number of users. The prefetch parameters, these all apply to every server. Number, message, weight parameters. At the end of this report, at the very end, it totals things up and tells you what -n and -mn should be as a minimum value. So it tells you if you have configured multiple servers, what you need for these other parameters in order to support all the servers that you potentially have. That should help you to stay out of problems like not enough resources available and messages of that ilk. In the middle of the report, we have each individual server. So if you have a login broker on port 9030 that's set up to accept both 4GL and SQL users, well, that'll be reported here, and the various parameters that go along with that. So you have the port number and the SQL parameters if they've been set, and then a list of the servers that have been spawned by that login port and how many logins each of those servers has. Lastly, there's the DB analysis reports. So these reports take the information from the DB analysis that you have run previously. They parse that DB analysis, and then they combine that information with data out of the schema area in the database, and produce some reports on on things that are a little bit easier to read than the DB analysis. So the area report gives you area by area what the tables and indexes assigned to that area are, what the rows per block is, what the calculated ideal would be for those rows per block, and some other information like that. The dictionary report is a one-stop shopping, simple dictionary report that makes it easy to see what fields are in which tables and what the data types with them are. IDX Compact is a report that shows candidates for index compaction. So this report will list the tables and indexes that you have in the database and tell you whether or not any of them are poorly utilized and should be compacted. As a side effect, it will also create a sample script that you could use to compact those indexes. The overlap report is telling you whether or not you have duplicate indexes that are partially overlapping each other. The meta dictionary report is like the dictionary report, but refers to the tables and the indexes themselves. Redundant is about indexes that are completely redundant, not just partially overlapping. And these indexes are probably wasting space. For instance, you might have an index on order number and order line, and then another index on just plain order number, which is a complete subset of the other one, and so is redundant and is not really doing you any good as long as all the other attributes are the same. The RM chain report shows you how long the RM chains are for each object in the database and calculates what the ideal would be for them so that you can see if there is a wide discrepancy there and whether or not there might be an opportunity to improve that through a dump and load. And the table report gives you table by table some information about the tables and what their ideal configuration would be and what storage areas you might want to move them to if you're planning to do a dump and load kind of process. So to summarize, you now have the ammunition to verify that you're following best practices and to prove that to external auditors and other people that are interested in that kind of thing. You should also be able to much more easily support any kind of migration, restore, or disaster recovery effort that you might need to deal with. But best of all, you can proactively notice changes that are happening in your OpenEdge environment. You'll see them in real time or nearly in real time and be able to take action depending on whether or not that was a deliberate act. And you'll be able to confidently answer the all-important what changed question if something goes wrong and other people are starting to ask what's going on in your environment. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, join us in the chat window or send an email to tom@wss.com. Thanks again.